Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea posts record high exports for September with on-year increase of almost 17%. Shipments of semiconductors leading the way to the country's 17th monthly trade surplus in a row. The South Korean health authorities affirm that if vaccinations continue, the country can take important steps back toward normal life this November. For now, though, with new cases still above 2,000, the current distancing measures will stay in place. And President Moon Jae-in attends a ceremony to mark Armed Forces Day. There, he says his recent proposal of declaring a formal end to the Korean War was based on the readiness of the South Korean military to defend the country. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea's exports in September extended their gains for an 11th straight month. Outbound shipments came to $55.8 billion, an all-time monthly high, and that was led by strong global demand for semiconductors. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea's exports last month jumped almost 17% from a year earlier, marking the 11th consecutive month of growth. According to the Trade Ministry on Friday, exports in September amounted to $55.8 billion to record an all-time monthly high. Exports in September rose by double digits compared to a year earlier, despite fewer working days. Several factors were behind the record high exports.
Exports were led by double-digit growth in intermediate goods such as semiconductors, petrochemicals and steel, as well as IT products including displays, wireless communication devices and computers.
Outbound shipments of semiconductors soared 28% to $12.1 billion, the highest for this year and the second biggest monthly figure recorded. Petrochemicals, steel and other IT-related products also posted significant increases. Exports to the country's major trading partners expanded significantly as well. Notably, shipments to the so-called New Southern region that includes ASEAN and India hit a record high, while exports to the U.S. and European Union also reached the highest for the month of September. Meanwhile, imports in September amounted to $51.6 billion, resulting in an overall trade surplus of more than $4.2 billion. This marks the 17th straight month that South Korea has posted a trade surplus. While it had been expected that the global spread of COVID-19 variants would take a heavy toll on the country's exports, outbound shipments in the third quarter came in at an all-time high of $165 billion, surpassing all previous quarterly results. The Trade Ministry said that if exports exceed more than $44.8 billion in the remaining 3 months, it will be the first time in 3 years that the nation has seen an increase in its annual exports. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has started another program as of today to try and boost consumer spending, which has been lagging because of the social distancing measures. People who spend more money on their cards here in the next 2 months than they did on average earlier this year will get back up to 100,000 won, or about $85. You can sign up through your bank or card company. Ji-young has the details.
Consumers in South Korea will be able to get a small amount of money back if they spend more than usual. Applications for a cashback scheme where consumers across the nation can get 10% cashback on their extra credit or debit card spending starts on Friday. The program that runs from October 1st to November 30th is designed to encourage consumer spending amid the pandemic. Consumers can get the 10% cashback on their extra card spending per month if they spend at least 3% more on their cards than their average monthly consumption in the second quarter of this year. A maximum of $85 cashback a month can be claimed. The extra money will be given as card points that can be used like cash and will be given on the 15th of the following month. People can apply through their card companies by calling them or visiting their websites or branches in person. Anyone 19 or older in South Korea who has been using a credit or debit card from one of 9 major card companies in the second quarter of this year can apply. Foreigners are also eligible. The application dates differ depending on a person's birth year. Those who were born in a year ending in 1 or 6 can apply on Friday, with applications to continue from Tuesday and will be open until November 30th. The cashback scheme can be used in a variety of places and also online, including food delivery apps. However, purchases made at big supermarket chains, major department stores, and big online stores will not be included in the scheme. The government has allocated almost $600 million for this program, but if the allotted fund runs out, the program can be ended earlier than expected. 엄지영, Arirang News.
South Korea and the U.S. held talks Thursday on environmental issues, including energy security and ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Foreign Ministry said Friday that its Director General for Climate Change met with U.S. State Department officials in Washington at the 8th Energy Security Dialogue. The South Korean side explained its ongoing efforts toward an energy transition and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and stressed the importance of bilateral cooperation. The U.S. also said they should work together to achieve an energy transition globally. These were the first bilateral talks on energy security since the South Korea-U.S. summit in May. U.S. lawmakers have agreed to a short-term funding bill to avert a government shutdown, but they're still wrangling over the Biden administration's spending plan and the need to raise the government's debt ceiling. Without a compromise on the debt ceiling, the U.S. government could face default. Kim Sung-min reports.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday signed a bill that'll keep the government running through December 3rd, narrowly averting a government shutdown. The government funding was set to expire at midnight, which would have forced federal museums, national parks, and safety programs to close. The bill includes some $29 billion in additional disaster relief, as well as over $6 billion for Afghan refugee resettlement. After signing the bill, Biden said in a statement, quote, "It meets critical and urgent needs of the nation." This comes after the Senate and House each passed a resolution earlier in the day. However, while the shutdown was avoided, there's another problem looming around the U.S. debt ceiling. Lawmakers will have to raise or suspend the debt ceiling by October 18th to prevent a possible default on U.S. debt, as a measure signed by Biden does not include such a provision. Last week, an almost identical funding bill was passed by the House, which included a suspension of the debt limit until mid-December next year. This was blocked by the Senate Republicans, who say suspending or raising the debt ceiling could allow Democrats to pass their multi-trillion-dollar spending package. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned that the federal government will likely run out of cash and extraordinary measures unless they remove the debt ceiling.
It is imperative that Congress address the debt limit. If not, our current estimate is that Treasury will likely exhaust its extraordinary measures by October 18th. At that point, we expect Treasury would be left with very limited resources that would be depleted quickly. America would default for the first time in history.
Meanwhile, the vote on Thursday on President Biden's trillion-dollar bipartisan infrastructure plan has been delayed amid a stalemate among Democrats. The infrastructure vote has been rescheduled for Friday, giving them a few more hours to reach an agreement on the bill encompassing climate change and the social safety net. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, as we just heard in the U.S. Congress, they've managed to prevent a government shutdown with a short-term funding bill. The markets were down on Thursday, though, in a big way, and the futures are down, too. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it continues to do quite a bit of decline, and it actually entered one of the worst September in the past. If you look at Dow Jones, it tumbled by more than 500 points on the last trading day of the quarter. and the S&P lost more than 1%, and NASDAQ declined by 0.4%. Clearly, the Wall Street is worried about the inflationary pressure because of the supply chain issues. And there's continuation of concern about the possibility of rate hike by the Fed if the tapering continues to be scheduled to happen in November and at the overall uncertainty about the inflation pressure continues. On top of that, the concern about the debt ceiling issues are continuing. It hasn't really passed the long-term changes in regards to debt ceiling. It just approved the short-term appropriation bills that would keep the government running through December 3rd. So obviously this is just a short-term initiative rather than a long-term solution. So clearly that is making the investor to be quite concerned about. All in all, the higher rates and the dollar strength, all that is resulting into the global market to correct, including the U.S. market as well as the Asian market, even also Korean market.
And this volatility on Wall Street spilling over into Korea, the Kospi almost back down to the 3,000-point level and the KOSDAQ down below 1,000. Again, retail investors seeing a chance to buy. Tell us about the domestic market.
Right. Clearly, today's movement is indicating that the Korean market gets affected by the global macro environment rather than the fundamentals. If you look at the South Korea manufacturing growth numbers, it continues to accelerate. The PMI manufacturing numbers came out, and it was at 52.4 in September, rising from 51.2%. If you look at the overall growth rate in terms of the export, it slowed down, but nevertheless, very strong numbers. And the job creation was fractional, but it's continued to be quite reasonably good. Domestic consumption numbers are, even despite these COVID-19 issues, it's reasonably good. And all in all, GDP growth rate, export, all seems to be quite reasonably good. But nevertheless, because of the currency movement, where the Korean won moved up to 1180 plus, and foreign investors continue to be a net seller today, not that much, but nevertheless, about 300 billion won worth of equities in Kospi, and about 100 billion won of equities in KOSDAQ. And that resulted into a huge decline because institutions really did not support the market. Only, as you said, the local retail investors are the ones that buying the Korean market. Today, the market has fallen quite significantly, almost touching near 3,000 territories for Kospi. KOSDAQ has gone down below 1,000 territories, so had been one of the worst day of trading days on the first day of October. If you look at the U.S. market, tends to be quite weak in the month of September and October. People are concerned about the short-term corrections, but nevertheless, we think that the fundamental is reasonably good, and that if the corrections continues into the October before the earnings seasons, we think that that is an opportunity. Even though a lot of people are concerned about third quarter numbers are going to be weaker than expected, I don't think that will be the case. Earnings numbers should be quite reasonably good, and therefore this time around, the earnings should be acting as a positive indicator rather than negative indicator.
And zooming out a little bit, oil prices still right near their peak. Factors pushing prices lower were offset by an expected rise in demand from China. Gold coming back up a bit today, though still quite a bit lower than its peak early in the pandemic. What do you see happening in these two commodities?
Right. In terms of these two commodities, that they're definitely moving differently based on what happens to the fundamentals and what happens to the macro pictures. Clearly, there is a concern about the supply chain in terms of the energy side. And because of the new energies, or so-called the renewable energy supply, seems to be bottlenecked in a sense that the wind power is not happening that quickly, and therefore demand for the oil or demand for the coal, it has risen quite significantly due to quite significant increase in the demand for energies due to the fourth industrial revolutions. So therefore, we have we have seen oil price rising to quite reasonably high number. But nevertheless, we think that the overall demand picture is not necessarily that strong. If you look at the rig count of U.S., where the shale gas are not producing as much oil as people that we've been seeing before. So we think that this is just the supply and demand issues rather than, say, so-called a very strong demand issues. So therefore, the oil price rising trend should not be a long-lasting picture, but rather we're trying to move into the carbon zero environment. And if that's the case, then the fossil fuel-related prices are not going to be here to stay, but rather stabilize from current level or maybe even fall in the longer-term pictures. But nevertheless, still, there's quite a bit of demand right now affecting the oil prices. As for the gold, as you know, when there's uncertainty in the financial market, it tends to show dollar strengthening as well as gold price rising. But if you look at the gold prices in the past several months, it really didn't do too much. So what that means is that the people are not too worried about the financial crisis. They're just worried about the short-term corrections. So therefore, gold are not really acting as a safe haven investment because we do think that the overall economic growth rate should be quite staying strong. And if you look at the September, the last quarter of the GDP growth rate of U.S. showed a 6.7% growth rate quarter on quarter on annualized basis. That is higher than expected, and clearly the global economy is recovering.
And just briefly before we go, Mr. Yu, the exports in September were at a record high, growing by 16.7%. Talk to us about what's going on that front.
Right. I mean, as we said, exports are doing very well. Manufacturing numbers are very good. Korean fundamentals seems to be very strong, but nevertheless, the market is showing some corrections. I guess people are concerned about the economic slowdown into the fourth quarter this year and next year, with the COVID-19 issues stabilizing, and it's the number itself should be on a normal basis rather than low base effect. So I guess people are concerned about the growth rate itself going down, but we must say that the economic growth rate is there, and therefore Korean export numbers should continue to be quite reasonably good, and it's not going to be turning into any negative territories. So therefore, we shouldn't be too concerned about the export numbers slowing down. And so far, it has shown very strong number of 16.7% year-on-year growth rate in September.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, thanks for sharing your insights with us today, as always, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
With the vaccine campaign in South Korea making good progress, the authorities are saying November will be the time to take steps toward a return to normal life, a policy being called with corona. With daily case numbers still high, though, the distancing rules will stay mostly as they are for another 2 weeks. Han Sung-woo has the details.
After mulling over when to make the transition, South Korea has set November as its goal for the so-called with corona, or a gradual return to normal life. At a briefing on Friday, health authorities urged the public to continue getting vaccinated and to adhere to health protocols.
If we can expand vaccinations and prevent the virus from spreading among those unvaccinated for the next 2 weeks, we can transition to a new quarantine system in November.
Officials also plan on widely expanding the scope for people with mild or no symptoms to be able to recover from COVID-19 at home. They'll have to apply first and be reviewed by doctors while in hospital before being allowed to do so. At-home recovery requires 10 days of self-isolation and monitoring through a mobile app. This comes as the South Korean government extends its current level of social distancing guidelines nationwide for another 2 weeks. That means level 4 for the capital region and level 3 for the rest of the country until the 17th of October. Bans on private gatherings remain the same, but a few exceptions have been made for special occasions. Starting next week, weddings in areas under levels 3 and 4 that are serving food can allow up to 99 people in attendance if 50 of them are fully vaccinated. Without food, the limit goes up to 199 people max if 100 people are fully vaccinated. To a lesser extent, restrictions have also been eased for first birthday parties, as well as for outdoor sports facilities. Currently, just more than half of the nation's population has completed the vaccination process. Meanwhile, the country reported another 2,486 new cases of COVID-19 on Friday. All but 35 were locally transmitted, with the capital area accounting for over 76%. 한성우, Arirang News.
A ceremony was held today with all three branches of the South Korean military to mark the country's 73rd Armed Forces Day. In a speech at the event, President Moon said his recent proposal of declaring a formal end to the Korean War was based on the military's readiness to defend the country. In any case, however, he stressed that South Korea will respond sternly to threats. Kim Min-ji reports.
President Moon Jae-in says he called for a declaration to end the 1950-53 Korean War based on his pride in South Korea's defense readiness. He spoke on Friday at a ceremony to mark the country's Armed Forces Day. Moon made the proposal last week during his UN General Assembly address to declare an end to the war that ended with an armistice with related parties.
나는 우리 군을 신뢰합니다. 나는 우리의 든든한 안보 태세에 자부심을 갖고 있습니다. 이러한 신뢰와 자부심을 바탕으로 나는 한반도 종전선언과 화해와 협력의 새로운 시대를 국제사회에 제안했습니다.
Moon's message comes amid a sticky situation on the peninsula, following a series of missile launches by North Korea, while it continues to issue statements regarding the development of inter-Korean relations. Moon said as a commander-in-chief, his top responsibility is to establish peace on the Korean peninsula. He added that the government will respond sternly to any threats. However, he did not mention North Korea's missiles directly.
국군 최고 통수권자의 첫 번째이자 가장 큰 책무는 한반도의 항구적 평화를 만들고 지키는 것입니다. 이는 곧 우리 군의 사명이기도 합니다. 국민의 생명과 안전을 위협하는 그 어떤 행위에 대해서도 정부와 군은 단호히 대응할 것입니다.
Moon said that South Korea will further boost its defense posture and will develop more powerful missiles after Seoul and Washington agreed to scrap missile guidelines. He also highlighted the recent military feats, such as the testing of a submarine-launched ballistic missile and development of a prototype of the KF-21 fighter jet. Moon noted the increase to next year's defense budget proposed at roughly $47.6 billion. That's up 37% since 2017, the start of Moon's term. This year's ceremony was held with the country's Navy for the first time in the southern port city of Pohang, where forces launched their first military landing operation during the 1950-53 Korean War. The Army, Navy, and Air Force performed a joint landing operation incorporating advanced technology to highlight the country's military strength. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
North Korea has signaled a willingness to restore communications with the South as soon as this month. Despite its continuous test firing of missiles, experts say the North will respond to calls looking to engage in productive talks. Kim Da-mi reports.
North Korea watchers say Pyongyang will pick up the phone when Seoul calls in the next week, in line with remarks Thursday by the North's leader Kim Jong-un. They say the regime now has room to engage, despite its long-held demand for an end to what it sees as a double standard when it comes to military drills by Seoul and Washington and what it calls their hostile policies.
By double standard, the North means the South Korea-U.S. joint military drills. There are not expected to be any exercises until next March, so there's no major obstacle to talks.
Also, he added, restoring the inter-Korean communication channels is not hard to do. Instead, the North is implying that future negotiations must align with its own interests and requests, unlike the rather unsuccessful talks of 2018 and 2019. Yet, the North's unpredictability continues, as seen in its test firing of a missile right after a reconciliatory message meant to show that dialogue with the South and its own military buildup are separate matters.
The North is saying, don't comment on our every move. It is insisting that its nuclear development is purely defensive in nature.
And while trying to maintain inter-Korean relations, Seoul's Foreign Ministry has once again pledged a continuous cooperation with the international community to provide humanitarian assistance to the north and achieve a formal end to the Korean War. In a policy report to Parliamentary on Friday, the ministry said Seoul has reaffirmed joint efforts with Washington to re-engage with Pyongyang. It further vowed to encourage China and Russia to take constructive roles in resuming talks with the North and to manage the situation in a stable manner. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
The city of Seoul on Friday launched an annual festival celebrating the many different cultures from around the world to be found in the Korean capital. This is the 24th Seoul Friendship Festival, which in past years has been held downtown at Seoul Plaza, but this year, because of the pandemic, is being held mostly online. In keeping with the reality of the pandemic, the theme this year is Enjoying International Culture in Seoul at Home. The city hopes it'll be a chance for people to feel as if they're traveling around the world. Taking part will be local residents and the embassies of 55 countries sharing what they like most about cities in their home countries and their traditional food. There are also contests and prizes. It runs through October 10th, and you can get more information at seoulfriendship.org. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.